Next up, Sarah Duro joins us to share key findings of recent research on the impacts of mobile work on mental health among trade workers in the oil sands industry of Northern Alberta. Sarah is a professor of sociology at the University of Alberta, where she also directs the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. Her teaching and research are in the areas of family, work and mobility, using an intersectional gender approach. Over the last 15 years, she has conducted a series of research projects on the social aspects of the Alberta oil sands, sharing her work through reports, publications, websites, and media. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm really pleased today to be sharing my work with all of you, and I'm really glad I could just hear the last part of the previous conversation. As Kelly said, I've been doing research up in the oil sands on and off for the last 15 years or so, and have turned my attention a few years ago to the question of mobile work and mental health. So I'm ready to start the presentation. If there's something else I need to do, let me know. I'll put it in full screen view. Okay. There we go, because that's all working, I hope. Good. Yeah, hi, everyone. So this project started in about 2019 or so, and I'm really glad to be able today to share with you some of the key findings of our study. As you can see from the quote on this screen, we ran into some pretty difficult and challenges among workers who fly in, fly out, or drive in, drive out of the oil sands. So for today's talk, I hope to start with a bit about our research project, the oil sands context. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the oil sands context, but I'll do just a quick overview. Also provide just a glimpse into the literature and what we know about mental health among FIFO and drive-in, drive-out workers, and then get into the heart of the project here in terms of our key findings. And then I hope to have a few minutes at the end to address what can be done and what we found from our study in terms of possible steps. So the oil sands, as you know, are Athabasca oil sands areas where I've been doing my research in and around Fort McMurray in Northeast Alberta. As you know, boom and bust over the last 20 some years. But at the height of fly in, fly out, there were up to 50,000 workers per year from all over Canada and the world who were coming in to work in the oil sands. And that, of course, has dropped. It's about half the numbers now from the stats I can gather. And there are more people who are driving in, driving out, rotating from within Alberta and adjacent provinces. And more of the work or higher percentage of it, I should say, is maintenance, shutdown, and thus sort of less predictable work. So a bit about our project before I share the relevant findings. Our research question asked about mental health. And today I'll be focusing especially on stress and stressors of the impacts of the experience of being a fly in, fly out worker in the oil sands. So our research question is there on the screen, and we used a mixed methods approach. And there were two phases. We did an in-person survey that had both open and closed-ended questions. It took about an hour to an hour and a half to complete, so it was quite an in-depth survey. We had 72 participants, and then we did a subsample of interviews to further explore some of the findings with a subsample of the participants. I should say this study was preliminary in the sense of being one of the first such studies in Canada. We're way behind places like Australia, who have been really doing great research on mental health impacts of FIFO. And so it gives us some initial understanding, but I think we do need to continue to do more of this kind of research for sure. So what do we know about mental health among FIFO workers in resource industries such as mining and oil and gas? And of course, we know that construction is an industry where there's a lot of mobility, so that plays in here really importantly. We know that there are increased incidences of stress and depression, anxiety, and self-harm, along with sleep deprivation and dietary or substance use challenges. There's also just in general, comparatively, research has shown there's sometimes lower awareness and certainly lower uptake of mental health resources than in the general population. Really important to this is that fourth bullet point, which is that geographical mobility and industrial precarity are both contributing factors to mental health challenges among mobile workers, rotational workers. And another thing is that I've become really interested in is that our existing sort of understanding and concepts and theories about workplace mental health just don't quite cut it in terms of being able to capture the experiences of FIFO mental health, which stretch the workplace sort of beyond, what we might think of as the workplace because of the very conditions of geographical and social mobility associated with it. I also really think it's important to tie to this an increasing amount of research on male-dominated industries and workplaces, including, of course, construction. And research is showing the implications of or what's happening in male-dominated industries for both men and women in terms of mental health. And the ones on the left for men are more familiar. The work for women, I think, adds another perspective, an important one, which is the sort of challenge of lack of acceptance. They're thought of as weak or bad luck. There can be psychological distress from harassment and bullying. And again, inadequate policies for everyone, but for women, for example, maternity leave and such as an issue that can contribute, of course, to psychological distress too. So to get to our study and the profile of our survey participants, I wanted to give you a feel for who participated in our project. And I've highlighted in blue the findings or statistics about our participants that have to do with gender. And all of our participants identified as either male or female. And then in brown, I've put the ones that have to do with sort of precarity and uncertainty within the industry and within their job situation. And so you'll notice that for example, we got 30% women in our study, which we were really pleased about. That's about twice the percentage represented within the oil sands trades worker population. And we found, of course, that women were, I shouldn't say of course, but unfortunately that women were making quite a bit, they were quite a bit more likely to be making less than men, even when we took into account some of the factors such as a type of skill, trade, and length of time employing their skill. And then the other important thing here was around discrimination and the fact that we had many more women, almost twice the percentage of women reporting some kind of discrimination. And then the precarity is clear there. We had almost all of our trades worker participants were contractors or working for contractors or were contractors themselves. And many had experienced job changes because of the timing of this was 2019 to 2021. The health profile, I'll just briefly point to the fact that there were higher incidences of diagnosed long-term health conditions and daily stress than we would find in many population indicators. And the fact that most people reporting working when sick, is an important finding that was really emphasized through some of the way people talked about FIFO, which was if you're going to fly, if you're going to be away from your family all the time and you're going to be sort of at your only reason you're there is to work, you might as well work. And even this quote from the supervisor at the bottom indicates, as long as you can pick your head up, I don't see the excuse, right, for not working. So to focus, our research, as I said, found quite a bit around stress and stressors. So I've listed here the stress areas that we asked about, where stress was emanating from, and have bolded the ones that have directly to do with FIFO, travel, living in camp, distance from home and family. But you can see that we kind of listed them from least to most stressful within this list. And so two of the most consequential stressors are directly related to FIFO, and that's living in camp and distance from home and family. Um, but of course, in lived experience, these all intertwine and intersect with each other. And even though there were no significant reported differences between men and women on these items, at least for the most part, our subjective findings from the interviews and open-ended questions on the survey showed that these do have sort of impacts for men and women in some similar and different ways. Spoiler alert, this is the model that, so there's a bit much going on here, but this is the model that came out of our project. And what's important about this is that the sort of a way in which stress circulates, right, and moves and compounds across the sites of the lives of these FIFO trades workers. So, there's on-the-job stressors, but these are inseparable from living in camp and traveling and, and moving back and forth from home. And that leads to a number of stressors in the middle here that we, sort of came up with as a way to think about mental health among these workers. So importantly, these stressors are again, sort of do have gendered effects, and so I'll be focusing on that a bit as we go through the results here. So over the next number of slides, I'm going to take each of these in turn and think about the stressors that have to do with different facets of this model, the different sites of FIFO worker experiences. So work conditions, to sort of start with the workplace itself. And interestingly, our participants mostly felt like they did have some trusting relationships at work, and that they did have some freedom in their work and really enjoyed the work itself. They really enjoyed, for the most part, the application of their skill, being able to solve problems and use that knowledge. But there were some buts with this, right? And importantly, the majority felt they had no control over their rotation and schedule, which was a real frustration. And I'll get back to that in a minute. And then the morale at the work site was not there was not a lot of high rating for morale at the work site. And in terms of discrimination, especially sexism and favoritism, were issues that came up here. But of course, as we saw above, stress from work was reported as some of the highest, right? So there seemed to be, somewhat satisfied with work, and yet stress emanating from work was certainly high. So what's this about? As you saw above, 79% reported some or a lot of stress from work. So part of it has to do with sort of the culture and the morale. And so there are many factors, but our results really ended up showing how work stress was tied in a number of ways to the male-dominated workplace. As this female worker said, entering the land of men. And for women, this had to do with having to prove themselves all the time, facing various levels of harassment, and having to sort of try to fit in at the same time, which was very stressful. And then a number of participants pointed out that the male-dominated environment was unhealthy for both men and women. As this male manager points out, so it requires this sort of intensified and sometimes exhausting, right, sort of engagement with sometimes a toxic masculinist environment, and tied this to mental health, where you just can't show any weakness. So importantly, the isolation and strain that results from this is not limited to the job site. It spills over into camp because you are working alongside and living and sleeping alongside and eating alongside the same people that you work with at the job site. And so, as listed here, people talked about isolation and entrapment, a feeling of entrapment in camp. And the fact that most workers, when they're on rotation of a week or several weeks or sometimes months, if they're doing a shutdown, never or only occasionally leave camp while they're on rotation. And certainly bad morale came up, food came up, and the length of time working in the oil sands seemed to matter here. So we don't have enough evidence, but the cumulative effects may be important to look at for people's experience of living in camp, and especially 6 to 19 years were especially negative. That morale in camp was not good. I'm not sure if you can see these. So it doesn't help that sleeping in camp is really hard. People are tired all the time. There are highly significant gender differences as well that need to be attended to. So in the top chart here, you can see that the frequency of waking up feeling rested at work is not great. So it's nearly every day. Occasionally or never is almost a half of the population that wake up feeling rested in camp. And then in terms of difficulty falling or staying asleep, we see the same kind of thing, that nearly every day, or at least a couple times a week, over half had difficulty falling or staying asleep. And this was twice as difficult for women in camp. So stress across work and camp adds to your isolation, right? Is kind of the moral of the story, that stretches from sort of the stresses of work spill over into camp. And it means that people are often isolating themselves to sort of avoid some of the difficulty of camp living. Women all the more so, because of the ways in which they and most of our women talked about this, that you can't be too friendly with people. You just kind of keep your head down and keep your boundaries and go to your room and stay out of the way of people. And for men, this often came down to just feeling like another number in a prison-like sort of atmosphere, in the sense that everything's regimented and pretty minimalist within the camp. But of course, this is inseparable from being away from home. Isolation in camp is also compounded from being away from home for, as I said, a week or more at a time. And so, as won't surprise many of you, a lot of our participants talked about the difficulty of establishing and maintaining relationships with family partners and friends. And the sense of being trapped, that you would not be able to get home quickly in case of an emergency, missing out on activities at home, etc. Interestingly, one of the things that we found, and this again would need further research, is that the more time people spent with family when they were home, intensified how much stress they felt from distance. And so again, if you have young children, intensive family life, most likely that's going to immediately compound your stress of distance. Importantly, this is not just about distance, but about travel itself, and even more importantly, transitioning between work and home. So travel itself was not high on the list of stressors, but it certainly came up, especially for people who were driving in, driving out more than flying. They had to face unpredictable conditions around weather and scheduling, because they might get a call, "We need you tomorrow," or there wouldn't be a flight when they needed it, that kind of thing. Long and tiring journeys. And here, rotation really matters. And it matters in many ways, but this was one to note, which is that if you're on a rotation where, like, you're on 1 to 3 days off, let's say you're on, 3 and 11, or something of that sort. Many of these workers were driving and driving out from somewhere in Alberta or BC or Saskatchewan. And so that was a very stressful thing, because often they were trying to just go home quickly, especially if they had family, for 3 days, which meant long drives and long and very tiring time while at home. So this rotation really matters to people's ability to manage the stress of travel and distance. On top of this, as I said, there's the transition, right? The sort of social and psychological transition between being at work and being at home. And so this came up a lot in terms of trying to catch up, as this quote on the left says, you're always trying to catch up once you get back to the other role. And for women who were mothers, they talked about the fact that they had to transition back into that mom role and being immediately on, right, to be a caregiver when they got home. And as this participant says, a lot of workers compartmentalize to cope. they sort of have these work selves and home selves, and they live in these kind of separate parallel worlds. And that itself makes the transition very difficult. You're gearing up to go home. You get there, you have to adjust to the family rhythms and family life and home life, and you're still tired from work. And then when you come back to work, same kind of sort of demanding transition of gearing up to go back to work, and the difficulty sometimes of having to leave home. There's also what you carry with you as you go back and forth. And as this quote from one of our male participants says, he was worried about, you come back home and it's hard not to be an asshole because you've sort of been in this tough mode and, working your arse off, right, for weeks. And so that transition can be difficult in multiple ways as a FIFO worker. So to kind of pull all this together, I want to sort of think across all of the pieces of this puzzle of that model that I showed you earlier, and the ways that these stresses compound each other as people go back and forth and rotation to rotation and back and forth between work site and camp and home. And they're not easy to bear or hear sometimes, these effects. And I want to tie these to organizational factors as well: rotation, boom and bust, the unpredictability, especially as a contract worker, contract trades worker, of when you might be called and when you might be put on what kind of rotation, and under what circumstances. So, as this quote on the left from one of our female participants indicates, she got to a point, especially after I think it was 60 straight. This kind of just constant rotation of 12 days on and 2 days off, where she didn't see her kids much for 3 years, trying to feed them and support them, and at the same time not being able to see them much, led to drinking and drugs. And there was a downturn in the economy, and she felt like she was trying to hang on to the last job in Alberta. And she also gained weight from all the stress. So the physical and mental sort of, as we know, sort of compound each other as well within these experiences. There has some dire consequences. And we know that within male-dominated industries, including construction, that there are higher rates of suicide. And we found this as well within our study, that 1 in 7 of our male participants had indicated thoughts of self-harm. None of the women did. And this has implications, of course, not only for those individuals and their families, but also for their colleagues. And so we heard from a lot of our participants about the stress of not only that can lead to your own sort of dire circumstances, but also the stress of encountering and having the loss of colleagues through suicide. And so that's an ongoing sort of stressor for a number of people. So all of this points to the urgent need for attention to stress, anxiety, and depression in FIFO-based resource work, including for those who lose one or more colleagues to suicide. So I wanted to, and this is exacerbated, of course, by the fact that in this culture of a particular kind of sometimes masculinist sort of performance, men don't cry, as one of our participants put it, and so how to actually sort of address that is a big question. So one of the challenges to change in this context that is really important before I get to the question of change and what that might look like, and that is avoidance of health care services while on the job. This was not something that we were necessarily thinking about when we started the project, but it came up over and over and over again, which was that while the majority, over 3/4 of our participants, had access to healthcare services while on site, the majority of them, especially for healthcare services offered on site, on their work site or in camp, were not likely to use them. And the reasons they gave for that were that they were concerned, especially in a precarious work environment this was during, a downturn, and most of them were contract workers, the concern of of not being called back for the next contract or being let go in some way. The degree to which this is actually bears out is another question, but the fact that many people were concerned about this is itself a concern. And then, as that middle quote indicates, and this was from I think a male manager. So if you got problems at work, you might not work. So you don't want to be the problem, especially in a minority and the brown guy, the black guy, or the woman. And so this is deeply concerning that people would not seek either health for physical or mental health. And many of our participants tied this along also with that kind of culture of silence around stuff around stress or issues that you might be facing. And one of our female participants who'd been doing this for decades, she said she's seen it change, that there's more emphasis on psychological stress and supporting people around mental health, but the culture, the sort of macho culture, she had not seen as much change in relation to that as she would have liked to see. So in terms of the response and what could be done, there are many of you will have a lot more insight into this than I do. I'm not a health and safety expert by any means, but we wanted to share with you some of the recommendations that came out. On the left here are recommendations that came from our participants, most of whom provided these at the end of the survey. We would give them a chance to just open-ended let us know. So healthier food, better camp conditions, more privacy. Anybody of you who've lived in camp, I have too. You can hear the person in the next room, eating their potato chips and et cetera. So it's that sense that you're never quite able to settle in camp was really important to trying to change that. More food options and better conditions. The move towards more individual bathrooms was a very welcome thing for just one's peace of mind and sense of privacy in camp. Needing more open discussion on mental health and training, and including, and this came from mostly the women and the racialized non-white participants in our study, of needing more focus on forms of harassment and the impacts of those. Better supports for mental health, especially third party. People said we do not trust the sort of the supports that are directly on site and or directly out of our employer, and so wanting a lot more third party arm's length options, including family counseling. And then services for people who fall through the cracks. We really found that the people who are in a more precarious position, like doing just maintenance or shutdown contracts here and there, et cetera. We need a lot more. We need more services available to people who might not have something robust through their employer. Better rotations, and I put in there because when we brought this up with our participants, almost to a person, they just kind of laughed it off and said, that's never going to change. We're never going to have any control or management over the rotations that we have, even though people have their favorite rotations. Part of this is interesting because those of you in this industry will know that some of the sort of worst rotations in terms of family and time back at home are also the ones where you can make more and getting a better paycheck. And so that balance for people was different depending on their family situation. But having some say over a rotation that might actually lead to better mental health was not something people expected to come their way, but should be, I think, a consideration. And then on the right, we have some of the additional recommendations that we added in our report, and we'll provide you the link to the full report, which is 150 pages, but lots of graphs, so it's easy to thumb through. And so again, third-party policies. Some of the companies in the oil sands have started offering having counselors on site, which is really important. One of my colleagues, Valerie O'Leary, who has been doing critical incident stress management for many years, indicated that what she thinks is needed also is that there's drop-in and not just sign up for a counselor ahead of time, but having drop-in time for right on in camp. Most of our participants were skeptical about online resources. They said people just aren't going to use them, and it's just too distant to be useful. But I'd be curious to know if other companies have found it to be found ways to make it useful. So services that travel with people, right? So family counseling, for example, how do you set this up so that it's actually available to people, whatever site they're in, whether they're at home or at work on a consistent basis? And making sure that there are industry standards, right, regarding sort of equity-driven mental health and well-being supports. Gender-focused psychological safety training. To me, this is so crucial for both men and women in the industry. Peer support and buddy programs. Many of you are probably aware of Mates in Construction, for example, out of Australia, which the Newfoundland Construction Safety Association has also taken up and has proven to be quite effective in terms of having a peer support on site, a work buddy that you can sort of rely on for sharing and mental health supports. And then finally, I would just say worker-led initiatives, I think, are really crucial. Workers know what affects them. They know what their experiences are like, and their voices in the process of initiatives to address and prevent mental health stress, I think, are really crucial. So with that, I will say thank you and look forward to questions and comments.
Thanks, Sarah.
Well,
We have one question here from Edward Pyle. Did you receive any indication that companies with better mental health supports perform better in terms of profitability and productivity?
Yeah, that would be another study, and that's a really incredibly important question. We were really interested in how workers experienced FIFO and the mental health impacts of that. And so partly for their anonymity, we did not necessarily collect information on their employer, and also for their comfort in participating, frankly. And so we did not collect employer information, but I think that it was clear through some of the anecdotal and subjective, right, sort of comments that participants made, that their experiences of mental health varied quite a bit depending on what kinds of supports were available to them within their company. We did not have enough of the sort of operational workforce to be able to do a comparison of contract and operational workforce, but that itself would be interesting in terms of this question of mental health and productivity. Other research has certainly found that investments in mental health, there's kind of a return on investment, if you will, right, in terms of retention of workers and also of their mental health contributing to their productivity.
Okay, so you can see up on the screen here, it's the website for the full study that Sarah and her crew did. It's also available in the chat as well. So if you go to the chat in the side of the streaming, you'll be able to click on that link. So that brings us to the end of your presentation, Sarah. I want to thank you very much for joining us today. It was very interesting. And hope you have a good day.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time.
Great. Thanks, Sarah.